Hello, hello, hello. Welcome everyone to the Starcraft Lorerun. It's a little bit long coming. Ironically, as usual with my Loreruns, I'm going to talk for a bit before we really get going. I hope that's at least acceptable to everyone. If it's not, well, that's kind of tough, because I'm still doing it anyways. But, you know, it would be still preferable if this was something you found, positive as opposed to negative. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to go ahead and go up here. Hello, everyone. Now, let's talk for a little bit, shall we? So, one of the things that was fascinating about Starcraft was the fact that it came with a manual that had tons of story and backstory to it. Now, this was not unique to Starcraft. Warcraft 2 and Diablo, the original Diablo, did the same thing. It was just, BAM! Have some lore. Now, there were a couple of problems with this. Whether this is a positive or a negative thing depends on your opinion, but they would reference a fairly large amount of backstory and lore in the manuals, and then basically never mention it actually in the games. I mean, they would mention it, they would refer to it, but they would do so in a manner as if you had already read the manual. This is actually a very classic example of it's all there in the manual, so, you know, that kind of a thing happening. However, just for you guys, I decided, and I thought about this back and forth, I was like, you know what? I'm going to just read the lore for you, straight from the manual. I actually managed to procure a copy here. Now, I will say this, I was actually rather displeased. Several moves ago, I lost my StarCraft manual, which sucks. It was one of the manuals I enjoyed rereading on occasion, along with Age of Empires and Age of Empires 2. However, I did manage to procure a PDF of this one, so, without further ado, Terrans. Although technology and world culture progressed rapidly through the 20th century, their advancements paled in comparison to the seemingly reckless leaps that would follow. By the end of the 21st century, mankind had seen bold and unprecedented changes within the world. Radical new technologies were surfacing at incredible rates, offering increased access to advanced computers and informational databases to even the most destitute nations of Earth. In the wake of the eradication of communism from the Eastern nations, nuclear weapons became available in abundance. The international power structure, once defined primarily by the acquisition of capital and military superiority, was blasted apart as third world nations rose to challenge the economic and military might of the world's superpowers. As the manipulative sciences of cybernetics, cloning, and gene splicing rose steadily into the public forum, militant humanist and hardline religious groups challenged the rights of private interest corporations who profited from genetic experimentation. Multitudes of people were being augmented with cybernetic implants, while others began to manifest slight physical mutations ranging from heightened senses to advanced telepathy. These dramatic changes with the human gene pool caused widespread panic amongst many of the fundamental humanist factions. Technology continued to evolve and spread, and population rates soared. Near the end of the 20th century, there were 6 billion people on the Earth. Within 300 years, that population had grown to 23 billion. Pollution and lack of natural resources and affordable fuels added to the fire as world leaders sought ways to stem the growth of their nation's inhabitants. Popular sentiment held that the world was plummeting towards an inevitable catastrophe as overpopulation and genetic alteration swept the globe. Quick note. Well, I suppose we'll wait on that. Let's just say that I think this was all deliberate, and we'll move on. Meanwhile, as tensions rose around the world regarding the use and capitalization of cybernetics and genetic mutations, many core international economic systems folded in on themselves and shut down. Horrific acts of terrorism and violence erupted between the corporate sector and the humanist factions, resulting in forced police actions across the globe. Irresponsible media coverage of these atrocious police actions spurred the already rampant civil chaos in many of the larger countries. Ultimately, the precarious balance of the world exploded into international pandemonium. On November 22nd, 2229, the United Powers League was founded. The UPL was to become the ultimate incarnation of the vision of a unified humanity held by the now-defunct United Nations. This new order encompassed and controlled close to 93% of the Earth's population, failing only to bring order to a few volatile South American states. Baronessa. The UPL was founded on the basis of enlightened socialism, but often resorted to fascist, harsh actions to maintain public order. With its control lasting for nearly 80 years, the UPL began to devise a rigid agenda that would unify the various cultures of humanity for all time. Great lengths were taken to eradicate the last vestiges of racial separatism, and the Unitarian Commissions banned many of the world's oldest religions. English was designated the common tongue of the entire planet, replacing many ancient languages that were subsequently banned in their own native countries. I just feel like pointing this out because this is one of the more amusing examples I've seen in fiction of trying to explain why everyone speaks English. Although religions were officially banned by the UPL, the organization held a zealous belief in the supposed divinity of mankind. This quasi-religious dogma called for the immediate eradication of any non-viral prosthetics or mutations amongst the more pure strain human gene pool. Fallout! Oh, excuse me. Hardline UPL proponents and scholars argued that genetic alteration, cyber technology, and use of psychoactive drugs had led to the degeneration of the human species. The UPL leaders formulated a bold plan that would ensure humanity would persevere, unscathed by the tempted corruption of radical technologies. Like the bloody inquisitions that devastated Europe 800 years before, the UPL set into motion one of the harshest agendas ever conceived by humanity: Project Purification. This genocidal crusade was the government's final solution to the matter of cleansing humanity of its more degenerate facets. The UPL scoured every nation on the Earth, rounding up dissidents, hackers, synthetics, cybernetically enhanced, tech pirates, and, of course, criminals, just for flavor. This planet-wide culling resulted in the eradication of nearly 400 million people. The world media, now under the control of the UPL, downplayed the more horrific violence and kept the general populace unaware of the scope of the atrocities being committed. Despite their heinous acts, the UPL succeeded in advancing many core technologies. Fields of research that had lain dormant for decades were opened up again, such as space exploration program. Guys, there it is. We just have to become a neo-fascist, horrifying Starship Trooper society, and then we'll be able to go to space again. Platform programs of the coupling of cryogenic hibernation with warp drive technology resulted in the ability to travel amongst the stars. Within the span of 40 years, the UPL founded colonies upon the Moon and many of the other planets within the Terran solar system. During this period, a brilliant young scientist named Samir Doron Doron Ruth made plans to consolidate his powers within the UPL. Uninvolved with the vulgarities of Project Purification, Ruth was obsessed with founding colonies on the worlds found beyond the Terran sector. Ruth was convinced of the discovery of new minerals and alternate fuel sources on the outlying worlds would make him one of the most influential men on Earth. Through his political connections and personal fortune, Ruth was able to secure thousands of UPL prisoners to use as guinea pigs for his secret plans. The prisoners, slated for mass execution under the Edict of Project Purification, were transported to Ruth's private laboratories. Ruth, planning on sending the prisoners off to colonize, had his science crews prep many thousands of people for long-term cryogenic hibernation. I skipped over the number there because it's actually inconsistent. Later on, they mention how each ship has like 80,000 people on it, and yet they say here they only put 56,000 people total, so it's kind of inconsistent. It makes more sense for there to be like 80,000 per ship, so you have an actual gene pool once they get to the Caprula sector. Cataloging the various mutations and cybernetic enhancements of the prisoners, Ruth had all the data put into a revolutionary supercomputer, the Artificial Teleempathics Logistics Analyst System, or ATLAS. Then processed this genetic information and was able to predict which of the prisoners would be able to survive the trial to come. Of these, a number were loaded into the 4 gargantuan automated space supercarriers. As the prisoners were prepped for cryogenic cold sleep, the ship was loaded with supplies, rations, hardware to assist them when they got to their destination. The navigation computer was then loaded with the colonies of the outlying planet Gantris 6. All of this seemed perfect in preparation. I want to point something out here. Just forgive me. I have a little more to talk about. But I do want to mention something. One of the points that I made several times, especially in Heart of the Swarm, is that it's pretty clear that Doron is behind everything that happens during Starcraft, Brood War, Wings of Liberty, and Heart of the Swarm. He's been pulling strings the entire time. When I was brushing up on some of the lore for this lore run, I started to notice a bit of a pattern, and I strongly I mentioned this as a theory last time. I think this is actually something I will go ahead and put my stamp on as very likely. I think Doron either is Ruth, as I alluded to earlier, or is at the very least someone very well positioned within the UPL at the time, because a lot of the things they do here very much adhere to his goal. Let's think for a moment about what Doron's long-term goals are. He's got two. Goal number one, he wants to get out there and get the hybrids going, get the army prepared for Amon, okay? Goal two, he wants to resurrect Amon. Now, I could see him as being ready to go ahead and have the hybrids be the sacrificial lamb, basically, for the plan to resurrect Amon. And yet, I feel like he probably came across humanity one way or the other and was like, well, wait a minute. And noticed that they had this predisposition towards genetic, towards having the psychic gene, basically, and decided to use them instead, because virtually everything that happens in the UPL, and later the UED, feeds directly into Doron's plan. I mean, literally directly into it. It fits so perfectly, I cannot imagine that these actions were not at the very least precipitated by Doron and his goals, therefore. Because notice what happens. The UPL decides we're going to purge the heretics, the mutants, the aliens! By the way, Starcraft is not Warhammer 40k. Let's just get that out of their way. But seriously, the UPL goes around and it's like, we're gonna be genocidal bastards, and right about when that's happening, when they have the power and capacity to go ahead and just wreck all of this, someone comes in and is like, well, you know, hang on. Why don't we take a bunch of these people who have these genetic disposition towards, you know, psychic tendencies and whatnot, why don't we go ahead and get them over here and send them off somewhere away from the planet? And this is great. They put them on these super carriers to toss them basically just a few light years over here to Gantris 6, which is mentioned right here. And yet en route, the Atlas computer somehow has a catastrophic failure, which accomplishes three things. Number one, it erases the location of Earth. Number two, it erases the location of Gantris 6. And number three, they happen to go halfway across the galaxy to the Caprula sector. Which, by the way, we'll talk about the Caprula sector in a bit, but let's just say it's kind of a nexus point for many reasons. That seems just a little bit too coincidental to be an accident. And then all those people actually somehow managed to survive and indeed thrive in this new era. Now, some of that is because a lot of stuff was put on the supercarriers. They actually make a mention here. I'm going to skip ahead in the thing just a little bit. They have these... They had limited cloning technology and some artificially inseminated embryos and whatnot already ready to go to help boost the population, to make sure they actually had the ability to have a diverse genetic pool once they got there. And, as I mentioned before, this is basically every person who already has the predisposition towards these genetic modifications on the world. So basically in the entire species, being put into one area who are now going to be breeding with each other. I mean, that just screams manipulation, especially on the genetic level to me, but that is just a theory. A lore theory! Thanks for... Oh, sorry. The Atlas was installed into the first of these supercarriers, the Naglfar. The three other carriers, the Argo, the Serenjo, and the Reagan, were programmed to follow the Naglfar as it was launched into the void of space. Over the course of this journey, which is later referred to as the Long Sleep, Atlas continued to monitor the humans, kept in cryogenic stasis, evaluating the numerous mutations and enhancements, yada yada. I kind of already mentioned this, we're going to skip ahead a paragraph. Originally scheduled as a one-year trip, their voyage took a turn for the worse. At some point during the journey, the navigational systems shut down, erasing the coordinates of Gantris 6 and Earth as well. Huh. The four ships carrying their hapless cargo in stasis barreled blindly through space at warp speeds for about 30 years. This is another reason I say there's no way that this is accidental. Starcraft is not the most hard science game out there, but it is still actually reasonably hard science. It's still leaning towards more hard than soft. And, well, how do I put this? Space is big, okay? I want you to imagine ships traveling across the galaxy for 30 years at faster-than-light speed, and then somehow managing to land on actual planets. Somehow. I wish Shadow was in chat right now so he could tell you the ridiculous astronomical odds of that happening. There's no way in hell that's an accident. The fact that it happened to be the Caprulu sector as well is just... no. One other point of note here, and forgive me for skipping ahead, and spoilers, by the way, for everything, of course, because it's a Lorerun. Forgive me for skipping ahead, but we find out later that the UED, excuse me, the UPL, and then the UED, were keeping track of them the whole time. How? 30 years at warp drive is a long freaking ways away, and yet somehow, they actually managed to keep track on them and actually be aware of what's going on. Now, there's two options here of why this is. Option number one, it's a plot hole. No defense, it's a plot hole. Option two, someone with, I don't know, advanced technology, with the ability to genetically manipulate things, who happens to be connected to this El Naga, might have arranged it to ensure that the UPL was able to keep tabs on everything going on in the Caprulu sector. Now, you might be like, well, why? And yet, if you think about it, the UED proved to be an extremely useful tool for Doron, didn't it? For more than one reason, as well. And the moment the UED stopped being useful, they were kind of expunged. I mentioned that point because there's one thing that we know rather significantly about Amon and Doron, and I'll be talking more about their relationship to each other later. And that's the fact that Doron and Amon both have this really dumb mentality, if I could just put it that way. And that mentality is, if it's not useful, throw it away. Like, literally, they're the kind of people who would use a hammer to nail a... Like you're working on a project, you're doing some carpentry, and you finish hammering all the nails in, and this is what they would do. Okay, we're done. Throw the hammer away. Toss it into the trash. Now, that sounds like an exaggeration, but that is pretty literally what both Amon and Doron do. They even mention this as a philosophy. The moment a tool is no longer useful, it must be disposed of. And this is true throughout pretty much the entire series. We'll be seeing this repeatedly over and over and over, that they just toss tools away. I mention this because this is exactly what happens to the UED. They show up, they do a lot of things which get lots of resources, lots of tech, and lots of personnel under Doron's control, and allow him to further his plans pretty much without a hitch. And then the moment he has gotten to the point where he no longer needs them, because he's already started the hybrid project, the UED just kind of gets wiped out. The Expeditionary Fleet, I should say, not the whole UED. Just... Again, just a little bit too coincidental to be an accident, I think. I do believe that Doron is the one responsible for the UPL and the UED's keeping track of things. And apparently I just lost Twitch. I'm going to guess that that's... quality options showing up. The recording's still going, so, you know. So, anyways, let's get back to reading the manual for a little bit here. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. You know, the carriers crash. Several of the ships make it. Some of the ships don't. A lot of people die. One of them lands on Umoja. One of them lands on Moria. And one of them lands on Tarsonis. Which you probably already see how that's going to be... working out there. The people who landed on Umoja and Reagan, and Moria, basically had no idea what the hell was going on. However, the people on Tarsonis actually had access to the Atlas, and they were like, "Hey, Atlas, what's up?" And they were screwed. This is actually kind of relevant. Yes, I did, Silver Dragoon. This is really relevant, actually. Some people have asked why the Terran Confederacy is the one that rose to so much dominance over Starcraft. And the answer is they cheated. They had cheat codes ready to go. Umoja landed with a ship, so they had, you know, technology and ability to regrow and grow and all that fun stuff. Moria, same situation. The Terran Confederacy had the ship that also had the supercomputer on it, with all the specs and the designs and the information for technologies and all that fun stuff on it. So even though they lost a decent amount of that technology immediately, they were able to rebuild much, much quicker. They had the head start, basically. So the Confederacy was, for all intents and purposes, several decades, if not more, ahead of everyone else when it came to the technological revolution, when it came to their progress and their ability to advance. So that's the main reason the Confederacy went to such power. Now, I could keep reading this for a moment. You know, there's the Confederacy, the Rebellion of Korhal, all that fun, horrible, terrible stuff, and of course the initial war. But I want to talk about one other thing really quick, if I may. The thing I want to talk about is the old families. Now, hands up. Who out there even knows what I'm talking about when I say the word the old families? I of course do, but, you know. Raise your hands. Genuine question. How many people out there are aware of what the old families are or anything about them? And while you answer that, I'm going to enjoy a nice, cool Canada Dry. Please give me money, Dr. Pepper. I love Canada Dry. Everyone should drink it. All the time. Always. The old families are evil bastards. That's actually not universally true. They're just, aristocrats. So, the old families, right? Well, the Naglfar, the ship that landed on Tarsonis, had most of the officers, the people who were actually in charge of the overall settlement mission, right? These people basically got together and said, all right, we're taking control. Like, the moment they landed on Tarsonis and came out of Crowsleaf, they're like, we're in charge. Bam! And immediately instituted what is effectively a military dictatorship. They were like, no, listen, we're going to make this work. We're going to control the guns. We're going to control the technology. We're going to control the information. And we're going to make it work. And they just absolutely established themselves. And as the society of Tarsonis, which would eventually become the Confederacy, progressed, the old families never stopped being in charge. They continued to be the group that had power, even when an actual Senate was formed, even when more republic and democratic things became the method of governing for the people on Tarsonis. The old family still had all the power, because they're the ones who founded the corporations, they're the ones who ran the military, etc., etc., etc. The old families consisted of a couple of major family names you may recognize: the Terra family, the Mengsk family, and the Duke family come to mind immediately. There's a few others, but those three are the big ones. Now, you might not recognize the Terra family because you don't know that November's last name is Terra. November Terra. Sometimes referred to simply by her shorter nomer, which is Nova. So, the old families, like I said, they had pretty much total dictatorial control over everything. Now, this is funny, because early on, the Confederacy, when it was first founded, was actually really awesome. But a funny thing happened. You had a group of people, it was like 6 or 7 families of people, who just had total power over everything. And they kind of let it get to their heads. This is fascinating to me, because... Again, the Confederacy was not actually an evil, horrible organization to start. It was just a very strict organization. But, you know, there were civil rights. People were taken care of. A lot of the money was actually spent on the actual, you know, the people and updating things like medical and education, that kind of a thing. But for some reason... And this, forgive me, because this is just such an alien thought. For some reason, the old families let it get to their head and decided they wanted more. And so they kind of just... degenerated over a couple of generations to the point where the old families went from being, we will rule these people for the benefit of them, to, we will rule these people for the benefit of us. And it got to the point where they got so slovenly, they would send their children off to these camps and these not schools, just resorts, basically, not bothering to try and teach them anything or educate them or take care of them or anything, just basically so they can go off and have sex with each other. And I'm not even speaking disingenuously, because they wanted the old families to interbreed with each other. It's the whole line of blood thing all over again. And they wanted to make sure that those kids would be raised in the right environment, aka we matter and no one else does. And it just kind of got worse over time, until it reached the point where they realized that the only way to maintain their style of living was to expand to a ludicrous degree. Like, imagine how human society has been expansionistic for basically all of its existence, right? Haha, Zeiss. So, human society is naturally expansionistic, right? But except for a few points in human society, that expansion is usually been at a decent pace, kind of like this, right? Well, the old families, the Tarsonis and the Confederacy was like this, and the old families are like, well, hang on, we need more. We need more! We need more! And so they just started just pouring everything, literally spending more money on expansion than internal development, which is one of the reasons why so many of the worlds, even to this day, as a Heart of the Swarm, throughout the Caprula sector are a wreck. Because they would move in, take, oh god! And they wouldn't bother to have any plan advance, or any infrastructure, or anything designed to actually settle the planet and colonize it, and then appropriately use it. They just walked in and said, quick, strip mining! Except on a planetary scale. So yeah, the Confederacy was literally rotting internally as they expanded exponentially, and that was a self-defeating thing, not just for the obvious reasons, but because the return on investment, for lack of a better term, was really low for that, because they were spending so much on continuing to expand, and it got to the point where they had to keep doing it, and this is what led to the Guild Wars. No, not the game. Good game, though. The Guild Wars is when the Confederacy would have this policy as part of their expansionistic thing, where they would make up an excuse to go for a planet that another power had claimed, either the Emotions or the Morians. I'll get to that in a moment. And they would say, oh, well, there's there's a wanted criminal on that planet. His name's James Raynor. So there's a wanted criminal there, and we need to go get him. We have to. Oh my God, he's such a dangerous person. Quick, send in our entire army to destroy this planet. This one guy. Oh, we'll just take over the mining operation, Moria. Don't you worry about it. And that didn't go over well with anyone at all. I'm not even sure why. There we go. Let's get rid of that. No, that's not going to work either. Hang on. We're having some lighting issues. We always have lighting issues on my show. There we go. That's a little better. The game actually covers a surprisingly large number of areas, British. It just doesn't feel like it because they don't really get across how large the Caprula sector is. It is a fairly large swath of terrain, though, that the Terrans have. So, yeah, actually, basically the Confederacy claimed Casus Belli on other claims and would move in and say, no, this is ours now. Char, believe it or not, was actually the last straw. They moved in and tried to take it. That led to the formation of two of the major mining guilds that had been founded on Moria, which I haven't talked much about yet, merged together, making the Kelmorian Combine. The Kelmorian Combine, hi Thork. The Kelmorian Combine basically got together. It's like, okay, look, we need military power and we need hardware and we need it right now. On top of that, I don't know, Silver Dragoon. On top of that, I could name how many planets are in it, Silver Dragoon, but I can't name how large it is in terms of geography, because we don't know, and that those numbers are never given. But a fairly large number of systems and planets exist in the Caprula sector. So the Kelmorian Combine started actually fighting the Confederacy on a large-scale war for basically the first time in Terran history. And the Emotions actually decided to support them because the Emotions hated the Confederacy. Note that this is actually before the Protectorate was even formed. This is just two relatively inexperienced groups fighting against the Confederacy. Now, here's the funny thing. The Confederacy had more... This is so indicative of how bad the Confederacy was at this point in time. The Confederacy had more supplies and more materials and more arms and more equipment. They had the big guns and they had the ships and they had the, the Goliaths were invented during the Guild Wars. And they were low on personnel. They had more guns than people. Literally. That is so indicative of the Confederacy's mindset at this point in time. It just makes me laugh. So the Confederacy said, like, we got this. And that's one of the reasons why the Confederacy didn't just roll over the other two powers, is because they had a bit of a personnel issue there. Now, unfortunately, a brilliant individual who was a lieutenant at the time and later became promoted to captain, named Arcturus Mengsk, was rather personally responsible for a large number of victories over the Kelmorians and over the Emotions, and that kind of led to some issues. And long story short, the Confederacy won. It was a very bloody victory. It was very costly, and it basically started the first real chunk of unrest in the Confederacy. Now, I mention that because that's an interesting point. Despite the fact that the old families were in control of the 90% and everyone else is in control of the 10%, that 10% was of a huge pie because of how expansionistic they had become. So, put it to you this way. It's actually more like this. There's the 90%, the 10%, and the 0%. Let me explain. The the old families are like, yes, we have life and luxury and everything's great. And then most other people who are on the core worlds, of which there are 13, sit around and they're like, yeah, things are okay, you know. I live my life, nothing's bad. I have creature comforts, I have luxuries, life is good. And then there's everyone else who were screwed. And that's why I call them the 0%. Because they were basically left to fend for themselves. A lot of what we see in StarCraft throughout all 4 games thus far is a lot of the people who are in that 0% or left over from that 0%. The people who colonized worlds and then were left completely abandoned by their governments. The people who, yeah, I know, right, Samurai? The people who would be set up and be given, okay, we will help you to take over this world. And hang on, we need to take all your resources and we're going to take all your food and all your food. Okay, bye. And so the 0% actually is statistically form of the bulk of the population of the Confederacy. And for some reason they were kind of pissed off at the Guild War in which most of their resources were taken in order to fund the war. I mean, I'm not sure why, but that would piss them off. But there it is, because some people get upset at the weirdest things. Now, so the Confederacy basically took over. The Kalmorian Combine was reduced to a puppet state. They were allowed to keep control of the corporations, and that was about it. And a fairly large amount of their resources were diverted to the Confederacy, or else. The Emotions, who weren't openly in the war, formed the Emotion Protectorate in direct response to this, and specifically started basically going up the tech tree, for lack of a better way to do it. A lot of secrecy, a lot of subterfuge. Most of the better espionage people and agents of the entire sector were all based on Emotion mindset and Emotion operations. Now. I'm going to pause for a moment. I actually meant to start with this. I apologize. So let me just say something really quick here, okay? I meant to start the entire lore run with this, and I forgot. I'm sorry. I love StarCraft. And I love StarCraft 2. Now, I will never say that you are not allowed to disagree with my opinion because that's stupid. And I will never say you have to agree with me or think like I do because that's stupid. However, there are only 2 games that I've looked at in the entirety of my career of the last 4 years of doing this show that have generated enough bile and vitriol amongst my fan base that I've actually felt the need to sit down and say, okay, guys, chill. StarCraft 2 is one of them. So I'm just going to make this really clear and plain. If you don't like StarCraft 2, fine. That's great. I love StarCraft 2. I'm going to be gushing about it. I'm going to be talking about it a lot. I'm not saying you have to be like whatever. I'm not saying you have to not disagree with me again because that's stupid. However, I'm just going to lay down some base rules. Number 1, if you don't agree with it, you don't like it, that's fine. If you cross the line, if you start getting argumentative, if you start pissing people off, if you start being derisive or insulting to other people for their opinion, that's the line. Okay? I'm going to warn you first because it's me. Second point, if you don't want to hear me gush about StarCraft 2, you might not want to watch it, because I'm going to gush about StarCraft 2. I love StarCraft 2. It's in my top freaking 10, okay? It's not there accidentally. It's there for a reason. So, laying that rule out there, those rules. I hate to call those rules, but I mean, like I said, there are only 2 games I've ever covered that have generated this kind of negative feedback, and StarCraft 2 is one of them, so... Back to the lore. So, in the wake of this, we have this wonderful situation where one of the core worlds had this brilliant, amazing leader whose name I can't actually remember. Yes, actually, it did. That is correct. Oh no, you're thinking about Mass Effect 3, aren't you? No, I'm actually talking about Fallout 3. Is the other one that has generated the other large amount of terribleness. Shoot, I can't remember the name. Hang on just a second. Is it Angus? No, it's Augustus, isn't it? It is Angus. I was right. Okay, so Angus. I had to look up his name really quick. Angus was a very powerful member. He was a member of the Old Family. And he was powerful and intelligent, and he believed that the Confederacy's policy was going too far. It is worth noting we're kind of left to debate if Angus was actually a good person, or if he was just trying to go out for his own personal power, which is very possible. Or if he was, how do I put this? He was still interested in the Old Family ideal. You know, in other words, we want all the power. He just recognized that what the Confederacy was doing was self-destructive. And as I've said before, it is a stupid villain who will actively ruin the territories they're trying to conquer. It's the Malik thing all over again. As opposed to the Revan thing. So it is entirely possible Angus was still an evil bastard. He was just Revan instead of Malik, and he just wanted us to, no, let's conquer properly, guys. We don't know. That is up to interpretation. Angus, by the way, for those of you not aware, is Arcturus Mengsk's father. Now, he basically led a revolution on Korhal, which was wildly successful. He is... Hey, Guido. He is... Hey, Plate Smash. No, nothing's different here. So, he was wildly successful. They took out all the Confederacy holdings on Korhal, and they kind of had no problem infiltrating them and pushing them away and pulling the fleets away and all that fun stuff. And for some strange reason, the Confederacy, who up to now have been just amazingly brilliant tacticians when it comes to long-term thinking, decided, well, what can we do about this rebellion? Why don't we send a few brilliant Apocalypse-class nukes to Korhal and raise the planet into a desert wasteland? Yeah! So the Confederacy nuked the planet. Just razed Korhal. For some reason, nobody took that very well. I don't know why. I mean, all they did was nuke one of their own planets into the frickin' Stone Age. By the way, one interesting note, because this is actually relevant. Before they nuked it, they decided to send in their very best ghost to personally assassinate Angus, his wife, and his son, not Arcturus, the other one, and bring back their heads. That ghost was named Sarah Kerrigan. Yeah. So, yeah, for some reason that didn't go over well. Angus already had quite a few allies amongst the Emotion Protectorate. Arcturus became a full-fledged ally of the Arcturus of the Emotion Protectorate, and the Emotions basically fully backed them. In case anyone's ever wondering, one of the main reasons why the Sons of Korhal became so powerful so quickly, well, there's basically two reasons for that. One, Arcturus Mengsk was a genius. I'm sorry, but there really is no denying the fact that he was a tactical leader, charismatic man who was a genius and knew exactly what he was doing. And the other reason is because the Emotion Protectorate was footing the bill. For some reason, the Emotion Protectorate had something against the Confederacy nuking a planet, glassing a planet. I don't know why. And then these sand people showed up in Korhal, and it just became a mess. So that's basically leading into the beginning of StarCraft from the Terran perspective. But Terrans aren't the only race in StarCraft. So why don't we stop talking about lore for just a moment and mention one of the reasons StarCraft exploded in popularity. 3 races. Okay. Most RTSs up to this point in time had 2 races, and yet most RTSs up to this point in time, I would argue basically all RTSs up to this point in time, the differences were mainly cosmetic. Warcraft 2 is actually one of the best examples of it. What's really the difference between the orcs and the humans in Warcraft 2? The spells that the ogre has and the ogre mage and the paladin have are different. The warlock and the mage have different spells. And a couple of the attacks work slightly differently, but for the most part, the differences between the two sides are purely cosmetic. That was the norm up until StarCraft. Even if you had multiple factions, they were basically just slightly different looking than the other. This is true in the Command & Conquers, this is true in the other series I can't think of, this is true in Dune. StarCraft not only had 3 races, but each one was really different from each other. This is actually still true to this day in the original StarCraft. The Terrans had a completely different focus, and they had a different... The way they advanced, the way they progressed, the fact that they could move their buildings, all of that was different from the Protoss, who couldn't move their buildings but had shields, and were more expensive but had higher stats, and had several unique technologies to help them in the micro side of things. And then they had the Zerg, who couldn't move but had creep and health regeneration and very fast, very cheap units, and also some weird things they can do with manipulation, and again, some interesting micro things, etc., etc. The point is, they really went out of their way to make all three races quite distinct from each other in flavor and in actual gameplay, which was really a new thing at the time, and even to this day is not exactly the most unusual thing to be done. And it was awesome. It was awesome to actually have that variance and to have the difference between them matter. And they did one other thing different. There's one campaign. Let me explain what I mean by this. In older games, and again, this is true in games not counting the Warcraft series, you would have one campaign, and which side you pick determines what canon is. And then when the next game came out, they would have to decide which side had won the previous game, because there's only one campaign. The two campaigns were completely incongruent with each other. Command & Conquer is one of the best examples of this. The original Command & Conquer. You can't have the Nod victory and the GDI victory. It doesn't work. Right? I mention this because, that was the norm. No one had ever done anything else. In StarCraft, there's one string campaign. The Terrans, the Zerg, and the Protoss campaigns all form one storyline, rather than each conflicting with each other for the same storyline. Make sense? So rather than having the multiple timeline kind of a thing, you had an actual story arc. This allowed StarCraft to have a strong story component, which was also unusual for an RTS of the day. I mean, tell me the story of Command & Conquer. I'll go ahead and save you some time. There is a decent amount of setting and flavor lore to Command & Conquer, but the actual plot is not bad, trying to get the Tiberium thing and taking over the Ion Cannon so they can hold the world hostage, or trying to defeat Kane and hunt him down to a Sarajevo temple and then kill Kane to end the threat against the populace. That's basically the plot. Even that's me exaggerating a little bit on some aspects of it. It's very simple. But because they had this one story arc, they were allowed to have characters. They were allowed to have plots. They were allowed to have actual development of the five points of the story. So, for a gameplay and lore reason, StarCraft was unique, it was innovative, and it was amazing. It's one of the reasons StarCraft exploded in popularity and why Brood War then exploded even further, but I'll talk more about Brood War when we get there. Now, I wanted to mention this here because I talked about the Terrans and the way they start, but why don't we talk a little bit, just a little bit about the Zerg. Now, at the time of StarCraft came out, we knew surprisingly little about the Zerg. We knew that the way they worked was the actual Zerg creature, which is the little spawn creep things, whose names I can't think of all of a sudden. They basically infest another species and then alter it on a genetic level in ways that are basically fantasy science, in order to manipulate him towards its own ends. And so the Zerg swarm, as an overall, would claim a species and then morph it into something of their own, and claim a species and morph into something, etc., etc., etc. It is emphasized that the Zerg... Yeah, this larva, thank you. The Zerg had been doing this for some time, well before the Xel'Naga found them. I probably should actually start with the Protoss, because that was actually before, wasn't it? So, let's rewind a little bit here. The Protoss, right? Hang on, let me go back to the manual. Because, well, duh. See, a few bajillion years ago, rough time. Blah, 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 blah. Let me just read here. Let me just read. You okay with me reading? I hope so, because I'm going to. Although only fragmented documentation remains, ancient Protoss texts speak of a highly advanced race that ruled over thousands of worlds in the galaxy, tens of millions of years ago, billions and trillions and quadrillions of years ago. The enigmatic race, who called themselves the Xel'Naga, which translates to wanderers from afar, was rumored to have seeded and cultivated thousands of various species on the old, cold and barren worlds within their domain. Protoss traditions hold that the Xel'Naga were peaceful and benevolent race, utterly consumed with the study and propagation of sentient evolution within the universe. Nothing is known of the origin of the Xel'Naga, save that they were not native to the galaxy over which they hold sway. Obsessed with fashioning the perfect life form, the Xel'Naga labored to create a creature that would be defined by a distinct purity of form. For thousands of years, they steered the delicate evolutionary process of their budding species. Although their protracted experiments produced many intriguing deviants and mutations, the races of the Xel'Naga cultivated always fell short of their enormous expectations. Despairing at last, the Xel'Naga focused their frustrated efforts on the most promising of their engineered worlds, Ire. A massive jungle world on the galaxy's fringe, it had borne a race of highly advanced beings. These beings were incredibly adaptable to the harsh natural conditions and climates. Their strength and speed were unparalleled amongst the other races known amongst the Xel'Naga, and the race had developed a rudimentary tribal society based on group hunting and warrior rule. However, their most distinct aspect was they communicated with each other through a complex method of instinctive telepathy, allowing them to operate communally with striking efficiency. The Xel'Naga were pleased with the progress of their latest creation and conceded that the new race was the first of their experiments to evolve beyond the feral constraints of baser life forms. To signify their ascension in the galactic order, the Xel'Naga gave the new race of the name of Protoss, which means firstborn. The early Protoss lived in harmony and seclusion on the world of Ire for hundreds of generations, never knowing of the Xel'Naga who watched them from afar. Although the Xel'Naga were the most advanced species to rise, although the Protoss were the most advanced species to arise, the Xel'Naga were still unsatisfied with their slow progress and decided to drive their evolution further. They spent another millennium, God, these large numbers. Blizzard, I love you, but stop using large numbers, guiding the steps of their children, eventually succeeding in leading the Protoss to the state of total sentience and awareness. The firstborn gradually became highly intellectual, introspective, and achieved great heights in culture, personal and individualistic achievements as well. Exhilarated by their success, the Xel'Naga made themselves known to the Protoss. Next page. The Protoss civilization spread across the face of Ire within only a few hundred years, eventually culminating in the warring tribes settled under the centralized rule. In an effort to discern the full extent of their creation's evolution, the Xel'Naga had come down from the heavens, integrated themselves into Protoss culture. The arrival of the Xel'Naga seemed to bring the scattered tribes even closer together as the overdried Protoss looked to their wizened creators for new truths and insights. The Xel'Naga marveled at how driven the Protoss were to plumb the mysteries of the universe. Around them, the Protoss harbored an insatiable lust for knowledge and sex that led them to develop radical progressive strains of scientific and metaneural study. As their understanding and awareness grew, the Protoss became exceedingly proud and began to see more value in personal achievements than communal advancement. Gee, where have I heard that before? The more successful tribes began to isolate themselves one from another, seeking to define their own rules, not only within their immediate society, but within the greater universe as well. As the tribes grew further and further apart, the Xel'Naga reeled in frustration. They speculated that perhaps they had pushed the evolution of the Protoss too far, marring the purity of their creation. Many Xel'Naga believed the Protoss had lost their greatest strength, as individual egos arose to overpower the once primary communal link. The tribes, driven by individualistic pursuits, rekindled their own ancient principles and rites in order to set themselves further apart from their brethren. Where once there was only awe and reverence for their creators, suspicions began to brew amongst the tribes regarding the interests of the Xel'Naga and their affairs. As the months passed on Ire, the Protoss began to shy away from their Xel'Naga teachers, and each tribe cultivated wild, unsubstantiated rumors of their creators' supposed treachery. Pause for a moment. Given what we know now about the Xel'Naga, I find myself wondering how much of these wild and unsubstantiated rumors were actually true. I also wonder where Amon was during this particular point in time, considering... well, we'll get there. This breakdown in inherent empathy... oh, hang on, sorry. Attempting to completely sever themselves from the rest of their race, the tribes began to lose their connection to the primal psychic link. This breakdown in the inherent empathy of the Protoss from one another did the most to dissolve the last remnants of unity and strength amongst them. The severing of the link was also the greatest sign, to the Xel'Naga, that the Protoss had tragically lost the most fundamental element of their greatness. Believing they had made a grave mistake in pushing their failed creation too fast, the Xel'Naga left Ire forever. The suspicious Protoss, at hearing of their creator's departure, acted with a rash, violent attack upon the Xel'Naga world ship. Hundreds of Xel'Naga were murdered by the raging Protoss, who only decades before had worshipped them as gods. The Xel'Naga fended off the reckless attack and sorrowfully launched the greater number of their massive ships into the trackless void beyond Ire. The tribes, left confused and abandoned in wake of the departure, turned on each other in despair, and what followed is recorded as the bloodiest, most violent war ever recorded in galactic history, the Ion Aeon of Strife. The raging battles waged during the Aeon of Strife were fought for countless generations of Protoss, all bent on perpetuating the guilt and blame for their abandonment. Although few records actually remain from this period in history, it is clear that the Firstborn devolved into frantic legions of merciless killers. Driven by centuries of unthinking hatred towards their brethren, they developed a game called League of Legends. Entire generations of Protoss lived and died without ever knowing the legacies of their past, or the psychic bond that their foretellers had once shared. It is legend that even the greater landmasses of Ire were devastated by the epic struggle between the maddening tribes. It seemed the whole of the once glorious Protoss culture was precariously poised upon the precedence of total annihilation. Fortunately, the very next thing that happened was the Vulcans showed up, and although there are many factors that led to the ending of the Aeon of Strife, one unprecedented discovery is cited with the bringing about the radical change of the Second Age. As the ancient vicious blood feud continued to take their toll upon another generation of psychic Protoss warriors, one eccentric mystic stumbled upon a pivotal insight. The mystic, whose true name has been forgotten in the annals of history, was eventually named Caste, or He Who Brings Order. Caste, Naladak, having studied the archaic, forbidden teachings of the Xel'Naga, unearthed ancient monolithic artifacts known as Kaideran crystals. The crystals, which were left behind by the Xel'Naga, were fundamental in facilitating their proto-genetic experiments. As an aside, Kaideran crystals, use the light energies of the Starcraft universe. For those of you not aware, there are actually two energy types in Starcraft. There's the energies of the Void, which usually have the deep purple hue to them, and the energies of the Light, which have the lighter blue and green thing to them. And you'll notice a fairly large amount of the different forces throughout the course of the game, and I'll be pointing them out as we go, use either the forces of the Kala, the light, or the forces of the void. Note that neither of these is evil or good or bad, by the way. Or evil or good, excuse me. It's just two different sources of energy. For the first time in thousands of years, the primal chord of the Protoss was tapped. Flooded by emotions emanating from every member of his race, Caste became aware that the Protoss had not only lost their primal link, but had not lost the link, but had forgotten how to attune themselves to it. Horrified by the warring emotions that had been tearing his race apart for countless centuries, Caste began to search for a way to heal the searing pains of his people. He gathered many young Protoss together and was able to teach the new generation of warriors how to access their latent bond. These young ones, suddenly free to distance themselves from the horrendous strife around them, were able to see clearly that the conflict of their race was folly. They believed that the Xel'Naga had been right to abandon them, because they're evil bastards, and because the racial essence had been corrupted by the rise of their ego. They maintained, however, that because their inherent failure was not of their own doing, the inner conflict of the Protoss and interracial turmoil was baseless and hollow. Caste developed a radical system of psychic progression that he hoped would discipline the new generation and keep them from repeating the tragic mistakes of their ancestors. His theory, known as the Kala, or the Path of Ascension, called all Protoss to forsake their own whims and strive to reunify into a great Soviet Union. The greatest hope of Caste was that the Kala would instill a new sense of essence and vitality within the Protoss race. Slowly, many Protoss gave up their ages-old feuds and rallied behind the ever-growing legions of the Kala. This marked the true turning point in the Aeon of Strife and led to the rise of the Second Age. As the terrible war subsided, everyone began to do stuff. Now, I want to point something else here really quick. The interesting thing to me is, if you actually had this kind of thing in real life, I feel like this kind of thing would actually happen. Let me explain what I mean. Imagine that there's this place over here, and they're at war. So war's happening, and it sucks. Imagine now that everyone in this war suddenly can feel the emotions and pains and otherwise just a general empathy for everyone else fighting, including the enemy. How long do you think that war would last under those horrifying circumstances? To me, I feel like the Kala and that connection is one of the greatest reasons why the Protoss stopped killing the crap out of each other and basically haven't really had a large amount of internecine conflict for a fairly large period of time. Up to Starcraft, at which point, well, we'll get there too. So the Kala came up with the caste system. We had all Protoss tribes were eradicated, and we had three new castes: the Judicators, the Kalai, and the Templar. The shift worked to remove the last remnants of the old hostilities between the tribes and strengthen the resolve of Protoss to embrace their new beginning. The Judicator caste was comprised of Protoss elders and statesmen, and with the main responsibility being the governing of Protoss law under the dictates of the Kala. The Judicator assembly was rolled over by a small group of elders known as the freaking Conclave. So, the Conclave, well, we know all about the Conclave, don't we? The second caste, known as the Kalai, I don't know how to pronounce that, comprised the greater bulk of Protoss society. It represented industrialists, scientists, workers who continued to rebuild their homeland after the harsh efforts of the Aeon of Strife. The third caste was called the Templar. They were the holy warriors and defenders of Ire, who followed their disciplines and ever-escalating pinnacles of psionic power. Under the new leadership of the Conclave and their Judicator Administrates, they armed with the zealous might of the Templar, the Protoss began destroying everything around them. Now, this is great. What happened is basically the golden era of the Protoss, where they expanded and found so many of the worlds that had been held over by the Xel'Naga. They took over most of the worlds held by the Xel'Naga, spread throughout most of the galaxy, actually. We don't know if they went as far as Earth. We do know the Xel'Naga went as far as Earth, but we're not sure if the Protoss did. The Protoss also basically took up the work of the Xel'Naga. His name is Arcturus, Grey Wolf. They basically took up the work of the Xel'Nagas, walking in and saying, yeah, we're going to go ahead and run things from now on. And doing the whole manipulating species' evolution and watching them from afar thing. Again, just like the Xel'Naga had been doing. I'm just going to skip ahead because this is kind of relevant. Although their new enlightened civilization grew and thrived, the Protoss Conclave kept a dark, shameful secret. There were a few dissident tribes who had refused to embrace the Kala, believing their individual identities would be erased to further promote Judicator rule. It's just silly. The rogue tribes were not hostile nor malicious. This is important. But they did believe that the Conclave's communal agenda would be the eventual doom of their race. Thus, the knowledge of the rogue tribes was kept hidden, for the Conclave believed their aberrant influence might spread throughout Protoss society and destroy all that Caste had accomplished. Convinced that the rogue tribes constituted a palpable threat to the new order, the Conclave ordered the Templar forces to kill all of them. I want to stress this again. The Conclave, this is well before Starcraft actually starts. The Judicators had already decided the Dark Templar needed to be genocided. Because they might pose a societal difference to the order that they controlled. I mention this because Protoss society is actually fascinating in its own horrible way. It is very stark, and yet it actually has a lot of depth to it. And this is very Protoss. The Templar were led by a young warrior named Adun, who could not bring themselves to slaughter their wayward brethren. Instead, the idealistic Adun attempted to hide the rogue tribes away from the Conclave. Adun believed that he could convince the rogues of the Kala's truth by teaching them how to manipulate their own latent psionic powers. Although their powers equaled those of the mighty Templar, the rogues still refused to submit their passionate free spirits to the Kala. Without the discipline of the Path of Ascension, the powers of the rogues spiraled out of control and unleashed horrible, devastating storms across the field of Ire. The Conclave, who found out about this, of course, were shocked that the Templar had not destroyed the rogue tribes and attempted to salvage the situation. If the Conclave punished Adun, then the Templar for their insubordination, they would be forced to publicly admit the existence of the rogues. So the Conclave decided to banish the rogue tribes from Ire forever. The Templar, under Adun, were sworn to silence as the rogues were loaded onto an ancient but functional Xel'Naga ship and launched into the void of space. Forever after, the rogue tribe will be known as the Dark Templar. That'll be relevant later, of course. Now, the Protoss watched, of course, as the humans showed up. And I'm just going to quote here. They proved to be an interesting study because they were short-lived and volatile, who accomplished a great many things in their short lifespans. 2 centuries passed as the Protoss watched over the budding Terran colonists. The Terrans had succeeded in building rudimentary colonies on over a dozen worlds within the Protoss's borders. Although the technology of the Terrans was inferior to that of the Protoss, they adapted to the worlds which they lived on and thrived. They found the Terrans to be fascinating in that they constantly fought one another and yet still advanced technologically and industrially by leaps and bounds. They were alarmed at how quick the Terrans were draining the natural resources from their various worlds, it seemed to the Protoss the Terrans had no respect for the delicate balance of nature, as they recklessly sped from one world to the next, leaving nothing but barren wasteland in their wake. It is worth noting that this is mostly the fault of the Confederacy, specifically. It is also relevant because it kind of explains one of the reasons why the Protoss look down so hard upon the Terrans. It's not just because, oh, you're inferior to us. It's not just because you have less technology than us. It's because they felt that the Confederacy was a good example of all of Terran mindset, which, well, that's like, hell, there's a billion real-life parallels I could pull. That's like looking at Hitler and saying, all humans are like that. You know, no. Now, the High Templar Tassadar, who I'm sure will never be relevant ever, was accompanied by his renowned Templar expeditionary force and found a number of small biological constructs floating on the borders of Protoss space. Upon closer inspection, Tassadar deduced that these were actually deep space probes. Although Tassadar could not discern their point of origin, it was clear they were heading towards the Caprulu sector. Tassadar brought the living probes back to Ire for study. The strange aliens were unlike anything the Protoss had ever seen before. The respective physiologies of the probes were apparently engineered for deep space travel and reconnaissance, and in an attempt to discern their primary quarry, the Protoss focused the energies of the Kaidaran crystals through the tiny minds of the probes. The Protoss were shocked to discover the alien probes responded quickly and naturally to the powerful energy of the crystals. The shock was garnered from the fact that only creatures born of the Xel'Naga's protogenetics could properly process the energy of the Kaidaran. More alarming was the vague thought that kept repeating through their tiny brains. Find humanity, eradicate, learn, evolve. The Protoss speculated the probes were the harbingers of a bold new threat. And, well, we'll get to that in a little bit, because they then go and wipe out a few Terran species. Now, again, Protoss mindset is great. So, there's this world, and it contains an alien species, but it's also infested, and the Protoss believe it is infested beyond repair. So the Protoss way of doing... I mean, how would you deal with that situation? Do you communicate with them? Do you try to evacuate the survivors who might not be infested? Do you try to, quarantine the planet and work on a cure? Or do you show up in your biggest ships and just glass the entire planet? That's the Protoss way of doing things, basically. Now, Tassadar himself really did not like doing that. He actually went out of his way to avoid doing that and actually disobeyed the Conclave on a few circumstances, refusing to glass too many planets. He did glass a few, but, yeah. Very Protoss. Purge the infidels. Yeah, exactly. Now, let's talk about the Zerg briefly, because... let's use our Cabrillion nukes. We got a few of those lying around still. A few Cabrillion. So, I mention this because this leads directly into Starcraft 1, of course. But why are the Zerg here? What we know about the Zerg backstory is, I'll be blunt, muddled, because it was retconned at least once. It's like this. One of the Xel'Naga was looking at basically kind of took the Zerg and uplifted them and turned them into the Swarm by introducing the Overmind to them. Now, I'm kind of skipping through a lot of this because a lot of this will come up during the games and I can talk about it there. All you need to know is that one Xel'Naga, whose name is Amon, I've already mentioned him, decided to take the Zerg and turn them into his own personal tool, like a hammer. And he pushed them after the Xel'Naga and apparently destroyed and consumed the Xel'Naga. And then basically engineered the Desire and the Overmind to go after the Protoss to start his hybrid project. Some people have asked, what is Amon after? We don't know why he's after it, but given everything about Amon's philosophy and his in-depth love, for lack of a better word, of the Void, it seems pretty likely to me that what Amon is actually after is the eradication of life that is not him. This is either, in my opinion, an aspect of absolute arrogance, or just plain vainglorious self-worship. I think it's actually the latter. I think he literally thinks he is the only one who deserves to continue existing, and believes that all other life forms are inferior. This also kind of ties into that whole mentality of dispose of a tool the moment you don't need it kind of a thing. Because to him, the thought of... I use this pen, but the thought of having to need this pen is personally insulting. I should be able to write without a pen, but I have to use the pen for now, so I'll use the pen and then get rid of it! That's Amon. This is my interpretation of Amon. Obviously, we'll probably find out about this next week. But it would make sense because what his goal is, at least, we don't know why, but his goal is wipe out all life in the galaxy with his pet Zerg, then wipe out all the Zerg, and then wipe out all the hybrids who wiped out all the Zerg, leaving just him. It is worth noting we don't actually 100% know if he wants to wipe out the hybrids too. It is possible he wants to rule over the hybrids, which would be the perfect being that are allowed to exist within his his galaxy. I mention this, though, because he engineers the Zerg onto a collision course with the Protoss, giving them coordinates for Ire and just basically saying, go that way. I'm sorry, I'm misspeaking. He doesn't give them coordinates to Ire. He basically says, you're going to be going in this direction, go get Ire. One interesting thing of point here. We don't know how Aemon died. We do know he did die. That is entirely possible, Tracker. It is very possible Aemon is just completely mentally gone. Like I said, we know very little about him. I'll be talking more about Aemon when we get to Heart of the Swarm. So a lot of this is just interpretation and speculation. I'm really hoping next week we'll learn a lot more about him. Aemon dies at some point along the line of this event. We know what happens after the creation of the Overmind, because he did that personally. We also know what happened after the assimilation of the Xel'Naga, because he was behind that. It is possible the Zerg went after him, but I find that very unlikely, considering he personally controlled the Overmind, and the Overmind's entire purpose was to be a yoke in order to control the Zerg Swarm. Because the Zerg Swarm existed regardless of the Overmind, regardless of Aemon and the Overmind. There was actually the Zerg as a species, and we'll talk about that when we get to Heart of the Swarm. And then, yeah, you see where I'm going with this. So, I'm not sure what exactly happened to Aemon, and again, I really hope we find out. But he's dead. So, the Overmind and the Zerg are left to just kind of generally go about their goal. It is also worth noting that we know Doron was active during this period of time. We also have some timeline stuff here. Let me pull up a number here just to give you a little idea of what I'm talking about with that. Give me a moment here. Hang on, I have to find the number because that's relevant to this entire story arc. Here we go. Okay. It doesn't say specifically. Just says millennia. Well, let me just put it to you this way. Given when Aemon died, it's very likely that happened sometime before humanity became an actual cultural species. We also know Doron existed at this point in time. Whatever real name you want to attach him, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to keep calling him Doron. It is very, very possible that Doron basically went out to try and further his master's plans, and may have had something to do with the elevation of humanity as a species. We don't know that. I actually personally don't think that's likely. I think it's more likely that Doron found humanity at a point in which they were starting to get decent, say right about the Industrial Revolution era, and then decided to go ahead and push them into the technological era. This is something fiction in general likes to do. For example, the human society advancement is kind of like this right about until a certain point in history. People argue about when it is, and then it just kind of skyrockets up, and it hasn't really stopped skyrocketing even right now in the modern era. A lot of fiction tends to try and give a reason for that. Why did humanity just suddenly start expanding so much and so rapidly, technologically, culturally, etc.? And so it wouldn't surprise me if they were trying to explain that, say it by saying Doron found us at about that point in time and was responsible for that upheaval. Regardless, we know for a near guaranteed fact, I would put like a 99% on this, that Doron is responsible for the UPL, for the expedition of the ships that I mentioned earlier, and all of that stuff. The relevance here, though, is all of that happens right about the time at which the Zerg have really started to expand, and somehow, we don't know the exact specifics, but somehow the Zerg becomes aware of humanity. And basically that leads to the Zerg saying, hey, that would be the perfect jump starter for us to go moving forward. Now, this is an interesting circumstance, because some people call this a retcon. I don't. This is one of the very few things I don't think StarCraft 2 retconned for StarCraft 1. In StarCraft 1, the Overmind and the Zerg all put tons and tons and tons of effort into capturing humans and into capturing ghosts specifically because they want their perfect psionic human to be Zergified. The only stated reason that's ever given for this is a stepping stone to the Protoss. And yet, even in StarCraft 1, the first game, not even Brood War, the moment they learn of Ayer's location, they're like, alright, let's go. Completely abandoning this whole hybrid thing. Completely abandoning the whole stepping stone thing. They're just like, nope, we're going straight after the Protoss. Why? I mention this because I think the plan, writing-wise, was always about having that backup plan of Kerrigan. I think that was always the idea and intent of the story. Because it makes perfect sense. Again, even within the confines of StarCraft 1, they spend a ludicrous amount of effort getting Kerrigan and converting her, and then they abandon her. Just flat. They take the entire swarm. Well, okay, they take a huge, greater bulk of the swarm to Ayer, and then they leave Kerrigan behind. Now, don't tell me she stayed behind on her own. Don't give me that. This was a point in time in which she was still yoked to the Overmind's control. So, why does Kerrigan stay behind? Now, there's two real possibilities here, by the way. I really should say the Queen of Blades, by the way, to make that more distinct. Possibility number one, this is Doron's influence. Remember that the Queen of Blades was actually directly, specifically relevant to his plans for resurrecting Amon. So it's possible he was the one who interfered in order to make that happen. Possibility two, this is the Overmind basically trying to subvert its own control in order to ensure that certain things happen in a certain way, and its backup plan is allowed to go forward and get its revenge on not only Amon, but prevent the annihilation of all life, which I'll talk about when we get there. Third possibility, it's both. It is entirely possible that the Overmind actually was trying to leave her behind for his own plans, and Doron was interfering to allow that to happen. Both of these are actually a possibility. We don't know. But I mention this because, again, this is one of the few non-retcons of StarCraft 2, because they clearly laid this out, even in the original game. Words. Okay, I think that's actually a lot of the original stuff covered. Now, before I begin the game proper, because I will actually be playing the game, I swear. I actually need to be right back. I'm sorry, I've actually been kind of ill this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the stream just to clear this up, make this easier to upload to YouTube. But I will be right back, guys, okay? So don't worry. I'll be right back.